You know that moment when you're watching, say, a bird building its nest, or maybe your dog tilts its head listening to some weird noise, and you just can't help wondering what is actually going on in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of fundamental curiosity is really what kicked off the whole scientific study of animal minds.
Right?
So today, we're doing a deep dive into a really foundational piece of work here, studying the mind of animals. It's by John B. Watson, and it was published way back in 1907.
Wow, 1907. That's really early days for this kind of science.
It really is. Think
Yeah.
about it. They were just starting to figure out how to apply, proper scientific methods to understanding animal intelligence.
Okay, so for this deep dive then, our mission really is to understand how those first scientific approaches, Watson's specifically tried to unlock the secrets of what animals think, but by focusing on something you could actually see their behavior.
Exactly. In that 1907 book, Watson makes this really key distinction. He talks about the difference between just casually watching animals, squirrels in the park or whatever, and the sort of systematic experimentation psychologists were starting to do in labs. It was a definite shift towards being more objective, getting away from just personal stories.
Okay, let's dig into that. If we can't, sit a cat down and ask it what it's thinking. What was Watson's core argument? How could we understand their minds?
Well, his main idea was pretty straightforward, actually. He said we can learn about animal minds by watching what they do very carefully, much like how we figure out what other people might be thinking based on their actions.
Okay.
He used this great example. Imagine you see someone running flat out for a bus and they just miss it. You see them slump their shoulders, maybe sigh.
Right, you don't need them to tell you they're annoyed.
Precisely. You infer their disappointment from their behavior. Watson argued, basically, that we could apply that same logic to animals. Look at the behavior to understand the mind.
That makes a lot of sense for actions, but what about something like language? Isn't that, a huge difference? Doesn't language give us humans a window into thought that animals just don't have?
Yeah, that's a really critical point, and Watson addresses it head-on in his work. His view was that language, fundamentally, is just a very, very complex form of behavior.
Ah, okay. Behavior again.
Yes. He sort of theorized that if an animal showed behaviors as complex and varied as a human's, it would inevitably develop some kind of communication that would be comparable to our language. So even language fits under his behavioral umbrella.
So it sounds like this focus on observable behavior really opened up the field. Psychologists weren't just studying like adult humans anymore.
Absolutely. Watson points out how psychology was expanding. They were starting to study infants, children, people with disabilities, even what they termed primitive peoples back then, and crucially, the whole animal kingdom.
Wow.
Yeah, he emphasizes just how vast that subject is. Mammals, birds, fish, even down to single-celled organisms. It just blew the doors open for research.
And reading his work, it seems like he was pretty tough on people relying on, cute stories about their pets or casual observations.
Oh, definitely. He really hammered home the importance of systematic study, of establishing facts, rather than just applying our own feelings or interpretations onto animals, what we call anthropomorphism.
Right.
He was quite critical of what he called literary naturalists. He felt they were more interested in telling a good story about an animal than in making really accurate, careful observations. He was very skeptical of anecdotes and these sort of wonderful statements about animal reasoning that couldn't be backed up with solid proof.
Okay, so if anecdotes were out, what methods were these early animal psychologists actually using? What did it look like in practice?
Watson really pushed for meticulous, controlled methods. So this meant setting up structured lab environments. It meant making sure the animals were healthy, well-fed, lived in decent conditions, because they understood that an animal's physical state could affect its behavior, right?
Makes sense.
And then it involved just really careful, patient observation, often over long periods.
And one of the big takeaways from all this careful watching was the idea of trial and error learning, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly. Trial and error became a really central concept. Watson gives this classic example of a white rat in what he called a problem box.
Okay.
He describes different boxes. In one, maybe the rat had to figure out how to lift a simple latch to get some food inside.
So what would the rat do at first?
Well, initially, it would just do loads of random stuff. Run around the box, sniff everywhere, maybe gnaw on the bars, push its nose into corners. Trying things.
Kind of flailing around.
Pretty much. Then, maybe completely by accident, it bumps the latch, the door pops open, and it gets the food reward.
Ah, the happy accident.
Hey.
But it wouldn't suddenly understand the latch perfectly then, right?
No, not at all. Watson noted that even after that first success, the rat would still do a lot of those random movements the next time. But, and this is the key part, over many, many trials, the time it took to get the door open would gradually get shorter, and the number of useless random actions would decrease until eventually the rat learned the most efficient way just to go straight for the latch. He described other boxes too, like one where it had to bite a string or walk up a little ramp, all learned through this same gradual trial and error process.
It's such a different picture from those earlier accounts, the ones that were basically just collections of stories about clever animals.
Totally different. He explicitly contrasted this new experimental approach with the work of earlier figures, people like Romanes, Darwin, Lindsay, Lubbock. They often relied on collecting stories sent in by various people, stories that weren't necessarily verified or observed systematically. Watson argued that wasn't good enough if you wanted to understand how the learning actually happened.
Watson also mentioned something about understanding an animal's senses being important. How did that fit into studying their minds?
Yeah, his point was, look, to really get inside an animal's mental world, you first have to understand how it experiences the world through its senses.
Like, what can it actually perceive?
Exactly. Which senses are most important for that animal? Are they as sharp as ours, or maybe sharper? Do they see colors like we do? Or maybe do they have senses we don't even possess? He thought answering those basic questions about their sensory equipment was absolutely crucial.
Okay, so summing this up then, it really sounds like this early 20th century work, with Watson's 1907 book being a prime example, was a major turning point. It shifted how we even began to scientifically investigate animal minds.
It absolutely was. The focus really moved, didn't it, away from casual stories and guessing towards rigorous methods centered on observing behavior in controlled settings. And this idea of trial and error learning emerged as a really fundamental way animals adapt and figure things out.
It really makes you think, though. Considering that intense early focus only on behavior, how might our understanding of animal intelligence have shifted now? With everything we've learned since then, from neuroscience, ethology, studying animals in their natural habitats, what parts beyond just observable actions do we now think are vital for understanding those complex animal minds? Definitely leaves you with something to chew on.